The following is a short slice of St. Thomas Aquinas' really big book, the Summa Theologica. He begins this section by asking the question whether there is an eternal law or not. And of course, spoiler, the answer is yes. He begins by defining law, and he defines it as a dictate of practical reason emanating from the ruler who governs a perfect community. Now, he assumes that the world is ruled by what he calls divine providence, and from this it follows, according to him, that everything, the entire universe, is thus governed by divine reason. And he contends that the very idea of government of things in God, the ruler of the universe, has a nature of a law. So why is this law eternal? Well, for him, he claims that the divine reason's conception of things, he says this is not subject to time, but is eternal. And his evidence for this essentially is an argument from authority from the Bible. He cites biblical text and then infers, since it's eternal, this law is also eternal. Now, there are all kinds of interesting metaphysical questions about God's relation to time in terms of whether he's subject to time or not. And the usual answer is no. And there's also the question of whether he is in time or existing in such a way that he's outside of time. And there's all kinds of interesting metaphysics here. But for the purposes of St. Thomas Aquinas, suffice it to say that, in this notion of the law, it is not subject to time. Now, what about entities that are less than God, specifically, natural beings like ourselves? Well, he believes that everything that exists partakes of the eternal law, and this comes in degrees. So this could be seen as like a strong influence from Aristotle, who of course is influenced by Plato, who had this conception of things instantiating the Platonic forms in varying degrees, lesser and greater amounts. And so Aquinas notes that all lesser beings partake of this eternal law in a degree, based on their inclinations to what he calls their proper acts and ends. That is to say, what they should be, what is proper to them, and it is, according to him, imprinted upon them. And he believes that rational beings, and this is borrowed heavily from Aristotle, they are kind of like, well, under God, obviously, but, kind of top of the mortal chain, because even though they're subject to divine providence, they're subject in what he says, the most excellent ways. And excellent to the degree they partake in their share of this divine providence. Now, he also believes that rational beings have more of a special status in that they get a share, a slice of eternal reason. And according to Aquinas, this gives us a natural inclination to our proper actions and proper ends. So again, he's borrowing heavily from Aristotle, bringing of God, of course, and having it such that we do have, as human beings, have proper ends, goals, and actions. And these are set within us by the eternal law. Now, the eternal law manifesting in rational beings like us is what he takes the natural law to be. So the eternal law, laid down by God, it manifests in us as natural, rational beings, and that becomes the natural law. Now, in terms of how do we know, good and evil, and this is a moral question, in part, like the good and evil part, but also a question in epistemology, the theory of knowledge, specifically the question of how do we know things. Now, what he does here is he, not surprisingly, borrows heavily from Aristotle, who borrowed from Plato, and this is something that's used by later philosophers for quite some time. And this is the notion of the light of natural reason. And in Plato's epistemology, in which he talks about his famous line, and even more famous allegory of the cave, he talks about the good illuminating the world of these perfect forms with this light, and it's analogous to the light of the sun in the physical world. So it enlightens things. It enables, metaphorically speaking, the soul to see the forms. Metaphorically, of course, because the soul has no eyes. And so this notion of a natural illumination and enlightenment is something that becomes embedded in philosophy, and not surprisingly, Aquinas makes use of it. So he believes that we have a light of natural reason, and this enables us to discern good and evil. And this comes from the natural law, which is, of course, for Aquinas, the divine light imprinted in us. So, roughly speaking, God, of course, is his divine light. We get a little bit of that light, shining on us. And then, metaphorically speaking, we can shine that light on things and see if something is good or evil. Now, obviously, it's not perfect, because our light of natural reason is imperfect because we're imperfect, so we sometimes do make mistakes. We might see the good as evil or the evil as good. And so he infers from all of this that the natural law is simply our participation as rational creatures in the eternal law. So we have God's eternal law in his view, then we get like a kind of a lesser version, like all we can handle is finite, imperfect mortal beings, and that is how it manifests in us. Or so he claims. So next, Aquinas turns to the question of whether the effect of law is to make people good. And he often does things in the form of questions. So he defines law once again as in the case of, broadly speaking, as a dictate of reason on the part of the ruler by whom the ruler's subjects are governed. And borrowing heavily from Aristotle, he asserts that the virtue, the goodness of any subordinate thing consists in being well subordinated to what regulates it. And Aristotle, of course, influenced by Plato, and Plato had this notion of a three-part soul, that there is the rational part that does the thinking and reasoning, there is a spirited part that is, spirited, and then the least for him aspect of the soul is the desiring part. And he believes that in a well-ordered soul, in the case of Plato, the spirited part allies with reason to control the desiring part. And Aristotle, adopted a bit of this and has this notion of the irascible faculties, which, if they're doing what they're supposed to, properly ordered, they're obedient to reason. And so, much like Aristotle, who is influenced by Plato, he regards reason as what should be the ruling force. And taking directly from Aristotle's Politics, he believes that the proper virtue of a subject consists in being well subjected to the ruler. So what do laws aim at doing? Well, following Aristotle, he believes that a law aims at being obeyed by those who are subject to it, that the whole point of law is to be obeyed, which leads to some interesting questions in political philosophy about creating laws that are not intended to be obeyed, and then you can get into finer points of debate about laws that are intended to be obeyed by, say, certain people, but are not intended to be obeyed by other people who may be somehow exempt from them. Now, in terms of what the law is supposed to do, he is taking directly from Aristotle. So Aristotle, as we'll see in the future when we talk about moral education, contended that the purpose of the state, or one of its key purposes, is to make the citizens good, to make them virtuous. And we can assume he's being sincere about this. This is not some sort of, dystopian deception where the state is pretending to be virtuous and lying about it. He seems to, as far as really think that the state should be instilling in people real virtues, being good, and making people good. But again, not in sort of some kind of dystopian deceptive thing where the state is actually evil and operating under the guise of virtue. So from Aristotle, he thinks the proper effect of a law is to lead people to virtue. And he believes virtue is what makes the subject of virtue good, and therefore it follows for him the proper effect of the law, what it's supposed to be doing, is to make those to whom it's given good. So you have this notion that the purpose of law is to make people good. And again, this is presumably not presented as a deception where it's all a lie on part of the rulers to subjugate and oppress people. I mean, it could be, but Aristotle, at least in his arguments, seems to take the view that the law should be generally good to make people generally good. So how about goodness in the state? Well, borrowing heavily from Aristotle, and it's something that Aristotle developed in his ethics, but also in his aesthetics, his theory of art and beauty, is that the goodness of any part is to be considered in comparison with the whole thing. And in his theory of aesthetics, in his work, The Poetics, he was looking at it in terms of, the parts that make up, say, the whole poem, the whole, play or story. Aquinas also cites Augustine, another saint, and Augustine, following Aristotle, and Plato and others, says that it's unseemly for a part to not harmonize with the whole. And Aquinas, also following Aristotle, not surprisingly, takes every person to be part of the state, and so to be good, a person who is part of the state must be well proportionate to the common good. And he believes the whole thing cannot be, be good unless the parts are proportionate to it. In other words, you've got to have all the parts, like being good, harmonizing with the whole, for the whole to be good. Now, so how do we have the common good of the state? And he believes that the citizens, or at the very least those governing it, are virtuous. And again, even though it's easy to be cynical about government today and assume that politicians and rulers are just saying empty words about virtue and so forth and goodness and are actually corrupt and terrible, Aristotle seems to be, at least in terms of his arguments he's making, and same with Aquinas, that the governors should be virtuous and the citizens should be virtuous too. And he believes kind of a minimal virtue for the citizens is that they're virtuous enough to obey the rulers. And again, it's easy to be cynical and imagine, deceptive, corrupt rulers misleading the poor citizens. But again, Aquinas seems sincere about this. The rulers need to be virtuous, and the citizens should be virtuous enough to obey good rulers. Which leads to the question of, what about bad rulers and bad laws? Well, he does consider tyrannical laws. So what are tyrannical laws? Well, his answer essentially, and given his view of reason, is not surprising. He says that a tyrannical law is not in accord with reason, making it, his initial assertion is, it's not a law, but a perversion of law. So this is an important concept, that laws can be tyrannical. And as he notes, being a perversion of law would presumably be a bad thing. Yet, he does claim, and this obviously could be debated, that in as far as a tyrannical law has like some lawness about it, he makes the claim it aims at the citizens being good. So how is this, what does this mean? Well, what he says is, all that a tyrannical law has in it, in terms of it being, a law, consists of three things. The first is, of course, essentially kind of essential feature of any law, is that it's made by, those who make the law, being imposed on those subject to the law. That's pretty much law by definition. And of course, secondly, any law that's created is presumably intended to be obeyed. And again, this can be discussed in particular context as to whether a law is intended to be obeyed and obeyed by whom. And lastly, this is clearly the most debatable, controversial part, is that even a tyrannical law aims to make the subjects good, and he says with respect to that particular government. Now, that of course raises many concerns about what it would be to be good with respect to a particular government. This may be interpreted as something like the government thinks it's doing good, but it's wrong about this, but it's acting in in ignorance, or some similar sort of problem. And so that would be his look at the tyrannical law.